This video lecture will look at the topic of natural experiments. We'll examine how they are similar and different to randomized controlled experiments. So what is a natural experiment? How would it be different from an RCE? So in this table here, we have the three criteria for randomized controlled experiments: that the researcher must be assigning subjects into treatment and control, and that assignment must be random. And so that way you can say that the treatment and control groups are basically equivalent. The only difference between them is the treatment. And that the researcher is the one that designs and administers the treatment. So these are the three features of an RCE. So let's look and see how natural experiments contrast with RCEs. First of all, the researcher assigning subjects into treatment and control, core feature of an RCE, is not the case with a natural experiment. With a natural experiment, there's something else that's going on. The researcher isn't the one that has that authority over who's in the treatment and control. It's a decision that happens basically through nature of some sort. There's some other mechanism that people get sorted into treatment and control. But here's the key that makes a natural experiment different than a regular observational study. It's that assignment into treatment and control is basically random, right? So this is the same as with an RCE. And so while the researcher might not be the one that's making the decision of who goes into treatment and who goes into control, this assignment is totally random. And what this means is that we can assume that there's equivalence between the two groups, between the treatment group and between the control group. Okay. But the researcher isn't the one who designs and administers the treatment. That happens through nature. So what happens with a natural experiment is that the researcher is taking advantage of something else that happens through nature, through some other policy quirk, where you really do have this basic equivalence, this randomization of who's in the treatment and control, and that way you can assess the causal impact of that independent variable, even if you're not able to actually implement an experiment yourself. So in order to explore what natural experiments are, we will discuss now the example of Jon Snow, who is somebody who first discovered really what cholera is. And so prior to the 1800s, we didn't know how diseases were transmitted. And in particular, we didn't understand waterborne diseases, and cholera is a waterborne disease. So this is a poster from the early 1800s, and you can see here some of the theories about how cholera is transmitted. So the recommendations here is that you should sleep and clothe warm and avoid drafts. This idea that cold air is bringing in cholera, or that you should be temperate in your eating and drinking and avoid eating unripe fruit, that maybe that's bringing cholera in. You shouldn't have cold water. And so it's really a lot of these poorly understood non-scientific recommendations about how to avoid cholera. And we know now that you receive cholera when you have exposure to a tainted water source. So when there's unclean sanitation, when basically the bug gets inside your water source, that's how cholera is spread. But at the time, this wasn't understood. So this is what Jon Snow does. So who is Jon Snow? He is known as the father of modern epidemiology, lived between 1813 and 1858, and he lived in London. And he's there when there is an outbreak of cholera in London. And this happens in 1854. And it's known as the worst cholera outbreak of British history. And during this 1854 outbreak, 127 people die over a 3-day period, and over 600 people die total. And people had thought that it was due to air pollution of some sort. It wasn't really clear what was causing this, but Snow hadn't been satisfied by these explanations. He wanted to really understand what was the root of what happened with cholera. And so he did something that people hadn't done before, which is he mapped out where people had died. And he noticed as a pattern that a lot of the cholera deaths were stemming from one neighborhood. This neighborhood here. So we see Broad Street, and there's this large dot in the middle, and then things seem to radiate out of there, that there are more cases that are right here and then fewer here, but there's still quite a lot of cases in this neighborhood. And so he has a thought, well, maybe it's this pump. This is a contaminated pump. He doesn't know it's contaminated, but he thinks maybe this could be the reason that people are receiving their water from this pump. But just because he sees, this correlation that people who live near this pump, that's not causation. And so he needs to check out some alternative hypotheses. And in particular, he's a little puzzled by some of the people, say, who live near here. These people also have died, but they live near another pump. And so what's going on with there? And he discovers and does some interviews, hangs out in this neighborhood for a while, and finds out that the people who live out here have actually gone and gotten water from this pump. They maybe had passed through the street on their way home from work, and the other people around here who aren't dying, they're people who got their pump from this water. And this happens just totally randomly. So this is a natural experiment. How? Well, the way that people chose what pump they got their water from was basically random. People didn't know that one pump was different from the other. And the water here seemed basically the same as the water over here. So it seemed as though the pumps were the same. But underlying it, the way that the pipes worked, that this water came from a totally different source than these other pumps here. And so the assignment of people, of where they're going to live, is certainly not done by Jon Snow, but it is basically random. The choice of whether you live on this side of Broad Street or whether you live a block away and then you getting water from this pump, it's totally random which one you're getting your water from. And if you happen to be living here and you happen to be getting water from this pump, that's when you're going to be more likely to die. And this means that we can say that these two groups are equivalent, that you're not going to have difference according to income. I mean, they basically all live in the same neighborhood, and so therefore, they're likely to be of exact same class. You're not going to have differences in hygiene. You're not going to have a lot of differences. The only real difference between these groups are which pump they're getting water from. And that means that it is basically a natural experiment. It's not an actual experiment, however, because Jon Snow isn't the one who's assigning people to live in these different areas. And he's not assigning the treatment certainly. He's not designing having a pump be contaminated, but he's taking advantage of the situation to deduce the real problem that's going on. And so this is something that you can treat as though it were an experiment, even though in practice it is not.